Good. Good. Thank you, David. All right. Well, this is going to be a little more of a time of teaching. It's time to look back at some interesting history, and I know everybody has a little different picture of what history is and whether it's interesting or something we're studying or not. But this is a topic that has interested me from a very young age, and hopefully I can present it in a way that you folks will enjoy and appreciate. Why are we studying this? Why is this important? And what's this all about? Just a little kind of intro from my perspective. I grew up, one of the kind of a tradition my family had for a while when I was young is on Sunday afternoons we would read out of Fox's Christian Heroes and Martyrs of the World. This is a pretty thick book, and this is about martyrs from about Stephen to about the 1600s, and it covers quite a few different people that have been martyred for their faith. And while a fairly somber book and reading material to go through, it was encouraging and something that I look back on as a good thing, to have read through that as a family. And an interesting thing, I think I was probably 7, 8, 9 in that range, and there are some pretty sobering topics, but it's good to remember, especially in our country and at this time, that we live in a time that's very unique in our history of the world, of Christianity, that we can sit here without any fear. We can sit here, we can hold a Bible in our language without any fear. We can read that Bible, think for ourselves, apply it. We can go out and share it with others without any fear of governments or other churches or other religious groups coming after us in this country. A very unique thing in the world right now, but this is a little window of time that we're living in. So that's one of my things that I think is interesting to me, and I think hopefully through this we're going to be talking about specifically the Pilgrims and Thanksgiving, but we need to lay a groundwork. We need to set up what was happening around this time before we get to the Mayflower or Pilgrims or all these other things. So let's start out by laying some groundwork, and if you will, hopefully we can kind of walk together through history and kind of see. We're only going to focus in on a few little places. We're going to hit the high points, and we're going to move kind of quickly. So hopefully I can communicate it in a fashion that don't lose anybody. All right, so starting out, we're focusing on England and the Bible coming to English-speaking people. A lot happened before this and a lot happens after this, but we're going to focus on this part. And I'm going to start in with a man called William Tyndale. He was a man that was kind of the first person to really bring a full English New Testament and have it printed. Things all kind of came together. Gutenberg came out with a printing press, which allowed the mass production of written material before it was all handwritten. And he was able to do this. The King of England at the time was Henry VIII, and he was not at all happy about that, and the people around him were not. England was Catholic at the time, and Tyndale had to flee. He printed the Bible in other places and then tried to smuggle them into England, and he actually funded his printing and his work by the king's men and troops would buy all these Bibles, and he got the money, and then he kept printing them, and they were burning them and buying them, and it was kind of an interesting thing. But finally, they actually, through some interesting circumstances, and I'm going really fast, take some time and study William Tyndale and kind of how the Bible comes to our English language. It's a good study, but we're going really fast. But Tyndale's betrayed, and he winds up in prison. He winds up and finally he is burned at the stake as a martyr for mainly for this, for trying to put the Bible into English and put it in the hands of the common people of England. And this is a very, very hard time in history. The government and the church control so much of people's lives at this time that it's hard to imagine in our time. So when that happens, the last words that we have recorded of William Tyndale is a kind of a cry out or a prayer, that his prayer was, "O Lord, open the eyes of the King of England." Well, God does that, and it's through a very interesting way. King Henry VIII, if you know anything about him, he had a lot of interesting things going on. He wanted to have a different wife. He wanted to divorce his current wife, and we won't go into all that, but it turns out he decides, why don't I just split away from the Catholic Church, and I'll set up my own church, and I'll be the head of it. Why not? As a king, and seemed like a good idea. He didn't really change much of the Catholic Church. He just said, now it's the Church of England, and now I'm the head of it, and we're going to just take it and kind of rubber stamp the thing, but we're going to move it over here. And it was interesting, when he did that, some of the people with him said, hey, you know what? This is really good. Of course, if you have a king that likes chopping people's heads off and doing these kind of things, and they said, you know what would be really, really a thorn in the side of the Pope? Let's print the Bible in English. And that's what he did. The same King Henry VIII that had burned William Tyndale, or had through various channels, he didn't physically do it, but had done this, he winds up printing what's called the Great Bible. It's kind of in the chain of progression, and it's, a lot of it is William Tyndale's Bible. And he wound up having it printed and had it chained to pulpits. And it was called the Great Bible because it was really big and big print, and it went throughout all England. Well, when you start putting the Bible in people's hands, things happen. People start reading it. People start going, wait a minute. What the church is saying, what the government's saying, what the Bible's saying, there's discrepancies here. And so the world starts changing. England starts changing, and people start thinking for themselves. And that's when you're trying to control people, that's a very dangerous thing. And so and so that's where we come in with the Pilgrims. We have a group of people, and even before the Pilgrims, we have a group that starts to separate away and look to purify this Anglican church, this Church of England, and they were called the Puritans. You may have heard of Puritans before, and we'll talk about them in a little bit. And then a smaller group of them were called the Separatists, who are basically saying, there's no way to purify this thing. It's already so corrupt. The government is telling us what we're supposed to pray and how we're supposed to pray and when we're supposed to be in church and how we're supposed to think. And we have no say in our church. This isn't the way the Bible shows church being structured. And so these people separated, and they were called the Separatists or nonconformists. They weren't conforming to what the government was saying in their church. And thankfully here we have separation of church and state, which is kind of an interesting thing. But at this time, the government and the church were working hand in hand. If you were rebelling against the church, you were rebelling against the government. If you did something wrong in church, there was physical government coming after you to punish you, to fine you, or like William Tyndale, to end your life. Not a very good time. So with all that, just a kind of interesting thing, we're to kind of fast forward quickly and to hopefully kind of whet your appetite for what we're going to be talking about in the next couple weeks. Thinking about Thanksgiving, this is kind of what, this is at least something I could find, this is what we think of as not necessarily we here, but our nation kind of thinks of as Thanksgiving. This is not, there's very little in this that has anything to do with Thanksgiving. But at least we still kind of do think about this. The dress, all of it's wrong. But it is an interesting holiday, and we're going to talk about why this holiday even exists, what it's about, and how the people actually looked quite a bit more like this. And they didn't all dress in black. There's hardly any buckles. There's even the dressing in black wasn't a thing that the Pilgrims per se did. It's more the Puritans and later groups. It wasn't them. They liked color. And very interesting, very complex clothing. We can talk about clothing another time, or you can talk to Andrew about clothing another time. That's very interesting stuff, but not for here. But so these are things we're going to be talking about as we go forward. Who are these people? Why were they doing what they were doing? And even a little bit of like what would have been like if we interacted with them today. That would be, and what did they believe? And why did they come to America? Why would you do that? So, continuing on. So, Puritans versus separatists. We have, this is John Winthrop. He's you may have heard his name before. He heads up what's called the Massachusetts colony, and they come later after the Pilgrims. He would be kind of what we think of as the Puritans. The Puritans are a much bigger group in England. They, in fact, are part of what heads up the English Civil War later on. This is 40, 50 years after all this. They are more of a political group. They're conservative. They want to purify England. They want to bring things back, but not all believers within that camp, as you might think of like a Republican or something like that. But they were would more align with conservative things in that sense. But the actual separatists, as we're going to talk about them, were a group that were definitely, from their writings and from what we can tell, were true believers that were studying the Word of God and looking at it and saying, we need to study this and think for ourselves and really take, and they really struggled with Great Britain forcing them to worship God in a way that they didn't see laid out in the Bible. And that was a very big thing for them. The government would, I mean, we're kind of seeing a little bit of this with kind of mandate things, but it's nothing compared to what these folks were dealing with. But that there was a prayer book that you had to use. You had to pray this way, and it was all written down for you. They didn't like that. The vestments, the priests or the ministers wore all these fancy outfits, and they were like, no, that's way too much. And it was a pendulum swing. It was a swing away from the Catholic Church. They were trying to get rid of everything that had anything to do with Catholicism, because they lived under it, and it was very bad. The sacraments, the things of the church, these various parts of the church that were things like communion or infant baptism or marriage, all these things had to be done in the church, done in a certain way to not get in trouble with the government and with the church, and then subsequently the government. The holidays that were celebrated based around the church, and just all of that, and the church government structure in and of itself, having a king or a queen who was worldly and immoral and whatever else at the head of your church didn't sit well with them. We can understand why that would be. We wouldn't want, even though we may like or dislike our current president or former presidents, we don't really want them at the head of our church. That doesn't make sense. That doesn't seem like a good idea. And so these were all things they struggled with, and so so this is this group, and we're going to focus in on one particular person kind of in this group, and his name is William Bradford. He wrote a book, and this is how we know a lot of these things. He wrote a book called Of Plymouth Plantation, and you can get copies of it, and it's a very interesting look. It's written very much like the King James Bible. It's a hard read. It's not kind of a fun storybook kind of read. But he writes down what happens to these folks and his interactions with them. And he is one of them. He is he's kind of the long this governor of Plymouth Colony. He goes over, and he joins them as a very young man. He is there's, from the studies I found, he was probably one of the people that kind of held everything together with this group, and he traces through many of the big events in their time frame. And so yeah, I'm gonna be reading little excerpts out of this book, and I would highly recommend, this is kind of another book to kind of add to your Christian list of good books, just for the fact of looking at a group of believers in hard times and how they work together. It's very, very interesting in that regard. So that is of Plymouth Plantation. But continuing on, so what were the struggles that these folks were having? Well, not just all these troubles with the Church of England, but you also wind up with a couple other things. So you have the church that's oppressive, but then you also have, because the ruling monarch is the head of the church, well, that can change quite dramatically between person to person. This is Queen Mary. This is the queen after King Henry VIII, and this is his daughter, and she wants to turn England back Catholic again. So all these guys that sided with her dad, who was trying to divorce her mom, and it was messy, bad. But so she comes back in and says, I love the Catholic Church, let's bring the Catholic Church back in. And by the way, all you guys that agreed with my dad, of course he was going to chop your head off if you didn't agree with him, or burn you or whatever. Now I'm going to chop your head off or burn you. And so a lot of them fled, and that was, so you wind up with monarchs that, the world can change quite quickly when you have a monarch that can change like that. And so this was something that was very hard on these people. And also the church. The church, because it was under the King or Queen of England, then kind of swung as that leader would shift. So this is the church. It still exists at Scrooby, England. This is kind of in the center of where these folks would meet. This is kind of where these separatists started. They were mostly farmers. They were fairly poor. They weren't very wealthy people or very well-to-do, but they loved the Word, and they had small groups that would get together and study and read the Word of God, and which of course was illegal. They weren't supposed to be doing this. Various ones would go to one group and listen to a sermon be preached, and then he would go back to another group and try to re-preach that sermon to the other group, because you don't have any way to record it. So you just take it in your head and go preach it to another group, and people got in trouble for that. And it was this idea of worshiping God by what you read from the Word and studying it, and all these things they were being persecuted for. And so and so and like I talked about, A Plymouth Plantation, this book from William Bradford. So William Bradford starts out as he is born in 1590. His parents die, both his parents die before he turns about 3. He is a fairly sickly child. He lives with relatives. And it's interesting because he's kind of in a farming community, but he's a sickly child, and so he winds up reading a lot. And so he doesn't do a lot of hard labor, in a sense. He's reading a lot, and so he does this. And then at about 16, he's introduced to these separatists, these little meetings of these people. And about 12 or 13, he goes and lives with one of the pastors there. It seems like his extended family that he was living with kind of disowns him because of his association with these crazy separatists studying the Bible and thinking for themselves. And so at 16 he becomes a full member, and so he is a part of this group of believers. And we continue on, and there is so much oppression and so much hardship in these folks' lives that they decide to immigrate to Holland. They call it the Low Country in this book, but the Low Country is this area of Holland because there's religious freedom there. Now, there's a lot more hardship there for them, and as we'll read, there's a lot of hardship there, but they're going to go there because at least they can be free to worship the Lord as they see fit. And so it starts out, they attempt a couple times to get over to Holland, and they have to leave by secret because the government won't let them leave. And so there's a couple different times where things turn out very poorly for them. There are ship captains that take their money and then betray them to the local sheriff or governor, and then they get captured off the boat, and their stuff gets rifled through, and their stuff gets taken, and they wind up in prison for some of their leaders for years, and then they try it again. And so there's a very interesting account, and they finally find a ship captain to take them across the English Channel to Holland that is not English. He's actually Dutch, and so he kind of feels like he enjoys the fact that he's stealing some people away from England, and so he's fairly happy about doing this for them. But things turn out rather sad for them in a very interesting way. So I'm going to read just a little bit. This is a very interesting story. So he's talking about, so there's been these failed attempts, but here's what he writes about this attempt. The next spring after, there was another attempt made by some of these and others to get over to another place, or get over at another place. And it so fell out by the light of a Dutchman at Hull, having a ship of his own belonging to Zeeland. And they made agreement with him and acquainted him with their condition, hoping to find in him more faithfulness than in the former of their own nation. The other captain that had betrayed them was English. He bade them not fear, for he would do well enough. He was by appointment to take them in between Grimsby and Hull. They couldn't go to an actual port. They had to sneak on board somewhere off the coast. There was a large common, a good way distance from any town. They wanted to be far away from the town, so somebody did alert the sheriff. It would take them a while to get there. Now against the prefixed time, the women and children with the goods were sent to a place in a small bark, which they had tied for that end, or hired for that end. And the men were to meet them by land. So they kind of split up the group. But it so fell out that they were there a day before the ship came. And the sea being rough, the women very sick, seasick, prevailed with the seamen to put into a creek hard by, which means close by, where they laid aground at low water. So the tide went down and the boat got stuck. The next morning the ship came by, and they were fast, that means they were stuck, and could not stir until about noon. In the meantime, the shipmaster, perceiving how the matter was, sent his boat to be getting the men on board, whom he saw ready. So the men get on board this ship, walking about the shore. So the men are there. But after the first boat was got aboard, she was ready to go for more, the master espied a great company, both of horse and foot, with bills and guns and other weapons. From the country was raised to take them. So he sees this from the boat. The Dutchman, seeing that he swore his country's oath, which is sacramente, which I think is something to do with the sacrament, and having the wind fair, weighed his anchor and hoisted the sail and away. So the men are on board, and the women are all stuck in this boat inland, and not a good situation. But the poor men which had got aboard were in great distress, for their wives and children, which they saw thus to be taken, were left destitute for their helps, and for themselves also, not having cloth to shift with them, more than they had on their backs, and some scarce a penny about them, and all they had being aboard the bark. So the men had all the stuff, the men were all on board, and the women and children barely had the clothes on their back. So it drew tears from their eyes, and anything they had they would have given to have been ashore again, but all in vain. There was no remedy. They must thus sadly part. So this happens, and you can imagine putting yourself in their shoes. This was a pretty dire strait for them. But their troubles are not over. They get into a horrible storm in their crossing the English Channel. And the men running the ship, the crew on the ship, are shouting out, "We sink, we sink." And there was kind of a back and forth, because these separatists are praying and crying out back to the sailors, "Yet, Lord, thou canst save. Yet, Lord, thou canst save." And so there's kind of this interesting back and forth. They do make it across, and it's actually people, according to this, people came flocking to admire the deliverance that other ships hadn't made it across. That they did make it across, and to kind of wrap up the story, the British government and the people that went and captured the women and children kind of went, well, now we're stuck with a bunch of women and children. What do we do? So they do wind up sending them over to Holland, because they didn't want the problem of having a bunch of women and children on their hands. So they did get finally reunited, which was a wonderful thing. But you can think about the hardship that they were willing to go through to find that freedom of conscience and freedom of religion here. And this is just getting to Holland. We're not even talking about going to the New World of America yet. So they first go to Holland. It's interesting. They go to Amsterdam, and this is actually a museum in Holland that Holland probably, and from what they said, this looks very similar to what they would have seen, except for the bicycle and the electric lights and street signs. But Holland's a very, very old country. And this museum is there in Holland, about talking about the Pilgrims and what they did there in Holland. And so they start in Amsterdam, and there are larger groups. So there's various groups that are coming over. This particular story that I told you about is what William Bradford experienced, being one of the men, part of that group, a young man of 19 at the time, not married or anything, but just a young man with the group, and recording what happened. And then through various things, it's interesting kind of studying this out. There was kind of a division amongst this group. And there was and it is kind of interesting to kind of think about the various things. They divided, and the group that we know of now as the Pilgrims separated and went to Leiden, another part of Holland. The reason the division happened, and it's interesting because you read it in here and it's like, oh, it doesn't sound so good. But I actually studied it, and the division was between them who went to Leiden, and another kind of pastor, minister man among them, and his group, and his name was Mr. John Smith, and he was kind of coming up with the idea that, wait a minute, why are we baptizing children? We should do full immersion baptism like we would agree with now. And so the division that actually happened in the church, they don't explain it, he doesn't explain it in this book, but the division was between them saying, no, we should do child baptism, and him saying, no, we should baptize adults. And so it was kind of an interesting thing. But they're studying the Word of God, and they're kind of pulling out these things. The Bible is a very relatively new book in their language. And so there comes a lot of these things they're discovering and trying to figure out, what does this mean and how do we apply this to our lives? So it's an interesting little tidbit that I found there about a division that happened amongst their group. But this smaller group moves to Leiden. And the many struggles that they run into there are, first of all, the language. They don't speak the language. Much of their goods were taken in their various attempts to get over, that were taken from them when they were trying to get over. And so they don't have a lot of resources, and they're forced to learn a whole new trade. A lot of them are farmers, and they come over to Holland, and many of them learn how to weave or learn how to do different trades. But you've got to start over at zero. You've got to start over at zero with your language. with your goods. William Bradford, he doesn't talk about it in his book, but other studies that I've done, he gets a small inheritance while he's there. He becomes of age, gets his inheritance, and practically kind of loses it all in trying to start a little weaving business. And so there is just a lot of struggle in this time. But one of the main things that really was hard on them, and they talk about it here, they were growing old before their time because of the hard labor they had to do. They were watching their children because their children were laboring alongside them in a lot of these cases. This is before child labor laws and all that. Everybody worked to provide for the family, as they say, as he writes in here, to keep the wolf away from the door. That means to prevent from starvation. But they were struggling with their children being kind of almost physically taxed by working so hard. And then on the other hand, also in Holland, because there was freedom of religion, but there was also freedom of many things that were not good. And it said, and the manifold temptations of the place that were drawn away by evil examples into extravagant and dangerous courses. This is all speaking about their children. And getting the reins off their neck and departing from their parents, some being soldiers, others took upon far voyages by sea, and some worse courses, tending to dissoluteness and danger of their souls, to the great grief of their parents and dishonor of God. And so this was their struggle. They were losing their children in this place. They had freedom to worship, but they were struggling there. And so after about 12 years in Holland, they decide to make a voyage to the New World. But like I said, they if anything, they lost some of their resources in Holland. They weren't any wealthier than they had been before. And so with all that, they make this decision, but they have to partner with some speculators, some investors, to help them go over to America, to the New World. That's kind of their next step. And so, but these folks say, hey, we will pay for your voyage. We will pay for the supplies and all these other things. And we'll make this whole thing a shares-based thing. You can have so many shares if you're an able-bodied man, and you can buy extra shares if you want to. And so they kind of put together this company, they call it. And but these guys who were giving them the money were all in it for the money. And so that was a struggle that they had, but they were basically indenturing themselves initially for 7 years, and then it gets even worse. But that basically all your work for 7 years or more, I think it winds up being almost 20 or 30 years, that they work off this debt, in a sense, that they've accrued to get them over there, because they have to send things back, send materials back, furs and what all, to pay off this debt. We'll talk about more about that, about the other hardships later on. But what happens is they have this community, and their main pastor at this time is a pastor called Pastor Robinson. Pastor Robinson is kind of their spiritual leader in this group, and it's very touching. We have his farewell letter or farewell prayer. We have this painting. This is in the rotunda at our nation's capital in Washington, D.C. There's a bunch of different paintings. They're massive. They're probably, I don't know, they'd probably go between like this pillar and the next pillar down, 2 pillars worth of just massive paintings. Been there when we were younger on a trip, but this picture's in there, and this is them kneeling for prayer as they're departing, and it's kind of hearkening back to what they were doing. But this is also some artist's rendition of what was done, because when they were painting this, it was at least probably 150, 200 years since, 150, something like that. And so this is what their idea of what happened was, but it gives us kind of an idea of what it would have been like. But this group is a small group of this body of believers is going to the New World. And it's not like we just go on a trip and we're going to see you later. It's we're never going to see you again in this. And the Pastor Robinson writes them a letter. It's a fairly lengthy letter, but it was interesting. I read through it and kind of broke it up, and I'll kind of summarize it, and then I'll read a little bit of it for you to kind of understand what his heart was as he was sending them off. He would stay back in England, but he was sending this group out. And it's interesting. He starts off the letter encouraging them, but he also, his first admonition to them is to check themselves personally for sin in their life, to be careful about sin in their life, and to be careful. And if you do find sin, to repent and make it right, and and it's a very interesting first admonition. And then a second admonition is to have charity for all, in a sense. He's talking about warning against divisions among the group themselves, but also how to be kind, to be careful of this group. And as we will talk about next week, they are going to get in very close quarters. It's going to be a very hard journey, and understandably I'm sure would get on anybody's nerves, just being in close quarters and different people and different thoughts and different ideas of what they were supposed to be doing. And so he encourages them to be charitable to all. And then his next admonition is not to quarrel with the non-believers around them. And to be a testimony to them. It's an interesting thing, and this is something we'll explore more next week, is that we think of the pilgrims as this whole group of people. There's about 101. By the time they get there, it's 102 because the baby's born on the way. But of all these people being all from the same church, well, no. It's about 50-50. There's about 50% of the people in this group are from this group of separatists. And the other 50 are what we would call, just people from the world. There's other people that are kind of adventurers. There's some families, but there are people that are not really associated. They're interested in going to the New World and making a go of this. But and there's a military man to teach them some defensive things, which we'll talk about as well. But they're not of the same church or same group, and so he's encouraging them not to quarrel with them, and to be careful of their testimony in this. And then his fourth admonition is also, and this is interesting, kind of in a sense, we look at it and it might be, I'll explain it and then I can talk about it. But work for the good of everyone is kind of his theme of this one. It's kind of interesting. And he's kind of encouraging, don't just work for yourself as you're out there. And it's an interesting admonition. We kind of think of, is that kind of, work for the good of the whole kind of, we kind of think of communist things. But it's an interesting admonition as they are all kind of have joined themselves together in this debt, as it were. He's encouraging them to not just to bear the burden together and to work in such a way that one doesn't just work for their own good, but to look out for the needs of others as a group. And then the last part, and this is the part I'm going to read to you folks this evening. And I think it's interesting because we start seeing little glimmers of what we know of as being self-government, governing ourselves. We take it for granted here that we get to pick who runs in different offices. Yes, sometimes the person we voted for doesn't get in, but we get a say. This is a brand new thing at this time. Never happened. You don't get to pick who's in charge of anything. And so this is something that it's interesting, he's cautioning them about it, but it's an interesting thing to think about. So think about it as someone who's never been able to pick who's in authority over you or anything else. And let me read this from Pastor Robertson's letter. Lastly, whereas you are become a body politic, using amongst yourselves civil government, and are not furnished with any persons of special eminency above the rest, to be chosen by you into office of government, chosen by the people to be in the government. Let your wisdom and godliness appear, not only in choosing such persons as do entirely love and will promote the common good, but also in yielding unto them all due honor and obedience in their lawful administration, not beholding in them the ordinariness of their persons, but God's ordinance for your good, not being in the foolish multitude who more honor the gay coat than either the virtuous mind of the man, gay in the sense meaning a fancy outfit that an administrator or a governor might have. So you're not just going for a fancy person. You want to go for someone who's virtuous and who's going to deal rightly. But you know better things, and the image of the Lord's power and authority, which the magistrate beareth, is honorable in how means person soever. And this duty you doth may the more willingly and the more sorry, they use some funny words. Because you are at least of the present to have only them for your ordinary governors, which you yourselves shall make choice of for that work. And so it's interesting. It's a little hard to follow, but he's saying you're going to pick these governors, you're going to pick these people over you, and be careful about it. And then once you've picked them, submit yourselves under that government and be wise with it. So it's an interesting admonition. And then he wraps it up, giving them encouragement from the word, talking about that we will all meet again. As believers, we have that hope. And he then encourages them and entrusts them to the Lord. And that's the end of his letter to them. So that's all we have for this evening. We're going to start in with them. We're going to, in a sense, we're leaving this group in Europe, getting ready to go. And we will talk about the voyage and talk about what they brought with them and other things pertaining to this next time. So to wrap this up, just kind of in summary, Thanksgiving is about thankfulness, and it's an interesting holiday. It's a beautiful holiday in the sense that we have the ability to take a time to be thankful, and our country still at least celebrates some semblance of it. But the Bible's full of admonitions to believers to be thankful, and it's interesting listening through this. The things that I drew from this study was first to be thankful for the Word of God in our language and the freedom to have it. Whenever you open the Bible, think about all the men like Tyndale and many others that laid down their life so that you can read this book, that you can have it. You can maybe have a bunch of different versions of it, or you might be able to have different kinds of them all around your house, and small ones, big ones, but you can have them without any fear of what will happen to you. It's something to really hold dear and to think about. Don't forget about that. Thankfulness for the freedom to worship, freedom to gather, and to have that. It's a rare thing, and it's been a rare thing throughout history. And then just thinking about the life that people have led in the past, and it's interesting thing to think through that we have a very easy life now because of the sacrifices of others, and that's a natural thing. That's not but it's interesting. We have the freedoms we have because of the sacrifice of others, and in a sense, these folks kind of represent some of those people that sacrifice those things. There's many others that come over to the New World and set up things, and though these people were flawed human beings, we kind of look at them as some of the first that came over and established this government where we get to pick our leaders, and we get to have that as an option, and have freedom to worship God and to meet together, to read the Bible, and to just enjoy the freedom that we have in this country.